I had no intention of hurting them. I just wanted them to stay. Jeffrey Dahmer, 1991. Jeffrey Dahmer, The Silence in Apartment 213. It began with a smell. Neighbors in the Oxford apartments in Milwaukee called it the stench that never left. They thought it was spoiled meat or plumbing gone bad. But on July 22, 1991, that smell became a headline, and the world learned what was hidden behind Apartment 213. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born in 1960 in West Allis, Wisconsin, a shy boy who loved dissecting roadkill and collecting animal bones. According to court transcripts and FBI records, teachers described him as odd but intelligent. His classmates remembered the smell of formaldehyde in his school locker. Even then, there was something quietly wrong. By the time Dahmer was 18, his fascination with death had grown into obsession. He committed his first murder in 1978. Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker Dahmer lured home with the promise of beer and music. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell, strangled him, and dismembered the body in his parents' basement. He buried the remains in the backyard, and when decomposition began, he dug them up, crushed the bones, and scattered them across the woods. It was his first attempt to make death vanish. After that, there was a quiet gap, almost a decade of silence. But silence, for Dahmer, never meant peace. In 1987, at the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, Dahmer met Stephen Twomey. He later claimed to have woken up beside Twomey's dead body with no memory of the killing. According to police statements, Dahmer bought a large suitcase, stuffed the body inside, and carried it back to his grandmother's house. There, he dismembered it in the basement. That moment changed everything. He had discovered what he called the power to keep. It was no longer about death, it was about possession. Over the next 4 years, Dahmer would lure young men and teenagers, mostly from marginalized communities, to his apartment. He promised them $50 to pose for photographs, offered drinks laced with sleeping pills, and when they passed out, he strangled them. He kept their skulls. He photographed their bodies. He preserved their hearts in the freezer. According to FBI crime scene reports, police found over 80 Polaroid photographs inside Dahmer's apartment, documenting every stage of his crimes: seduction, murder, and dismemberment. He arranged their remains like trophies. Human skulls lined the refrigerator. A painted skeleton stood in the corner. In his fish tank, bones floated between plastic plants. The neighbors knew something was off. Glenda Cleveland, the woman who lived next door, made repeated calls to the police, reporting strange noises, foul odors, and screams in the night. But each time, the officers brushed her off. One night, in May 1991, a 14-year-old boy named Konorak Synthesumphone managed to escape Dahmer's apartment, naked, drugged, and bleeding. 2 women found him outside and called 911. When the police arrived, Dahmer calmly told them it was a lover's quarrel. Despite the women's protests, the officers escorted the boy back into Dahmer's apartment, handed him over to the men who had just tried to kill him. Minutes later, Dahmer murdered him. That night became one of the most tragic failures in modern policing, one that would haunt the Milwaukee Police Department for decades. By July 1991, the end was near. Dahmer met Tracy Edwards at a bar and invited him home for photos. Inside the apartment, Edwards noticed the smell, the boxes, the blue barrel in the corner. When Dahmer tried to handcuff him, Edwards fought back, escaped, and flagged down 2 officers on patrol. They followed him to apartment 213. Inside, they found what no one could have imagined. A refrigerator containing severed heads. A filing cabinet full of skulls. And in the 57-gallon drum, human torsos dissolving in acid. According to court records from State of Wisconsin v. Dahmer, 1992, investigators discovered remains of 17 victims spanning from 1978 to 1991. Every detail was photographed, every object catalogued, a collection of horror built by a man who wanted to create zombies to keep him company. In court, Dahmer showed no emotion. He confessed in chilling monotone, describing each act with surgical precision. When the judge asked why, he simply said, "I was sick. I didn't want them to leave." He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, over 900 years. In 1994, after only 2 years in prison, Dahmer was murdered by another inmate, Christopher Scarver, who struck him with a metal bar in the prison chapel. Dahmer died instantly, the same quiet end he once gave others. The aftermath was complicated. His apartment building was demolished. Victims' families filed lawsuits. And society asked a question it still hasn't answered. How did a man so visibly broken, so obviously disturbed, move unseen for over a decade? Experts called him a psychopath. Psychiatrists called him a necrophile with obsessive-compulsive disorder. But those who studied him longest, the detectives, the attorneys, the survivors, said something else entirely. Dahmer wasn't a monster born, he was a void created. Loneliness turned inward. Curiosity turned monstrous. And silence became his accomplice. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Information derived from verified public records, court filings, FBI case files, and news investigations. Ted Bundy, The Mask of Charm. Murder is not about lust or violence. It's about possession. The last word of possession. Ted Bundy, 1989. It started with a smile. The kind of smile that could disarm suspicion, calm fear, and hide evil in plain sight. When people described Theodore Robert Bundy, they used words like handsome, intelligent, and polite. Few knew that behind that charm was a man who would become one of America's most prolific serial killers, a predator who used normalcy as camouflage and charisma as a weapon. Bundy's story is one of contradiction. He volunteered on political campaigns, studied law, and even worked at a suicide hotline in Seattle, helping strangers find reasons to live, while secretly planning the deaths of others. He attended the University of Washington, shook hands with state politicians, and carried himself like a man who had his future mapped out. But deep inside, he was mapping something else entirely. Routes, locations, and routines, the architecture of murder. The early shadow. Ted Bundy was born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. He grew up believing his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents. That early deception, according to psychologists cited in court-ordered evaluations, formed the fractured foundation of his identity, a man built on lies from the beginning. As a teenager, Bundy watched the world through windows. He followed women he found attractive, studied their movements, and later admitted to stealing their belongings for comfort. It wasn't about violence, not yet. It was about control. By the 1970s, the facade of the model student began to crack. He enrolled in law school but dropped out, restless and unfocused. His first known murder, according to FBI records and state indictments, likely occurred in 1974, the disappearance of Linda and Healy, a University of Washington student who vanished from her bed without a struggle. Investigators later found her skull on Taylor Mountain, alongside the remains of other missing women. Bundy had begun his transformation, from voyeur to hunter. A pattern emerges. In 1974 alone, at least 8 women vanished across Washington, Oregon, and Utah. All were young, intelligent, and dark-haired, often wearing their hair parted down the middle. Witnesses described a charming man with his arm in a sling, asking for help loading a sailboat or carrying books to his car. He introduced himself simply as Ted. That small detail, almost careless, would later help tie his killings together. According to police reports from Salt Lake City and Seattle, Bundy's method was chillingly consistent. He approached his victims in daylight, used kindness to lower their guard, and then struck, often with a crowbar or wrench. He would abduct them, assault them, and later revisit their remains, sometimes washing and grooming them like living dolls. When investigators began connecting the cases, Bundy fled the state. He was already thinking several steps ahead, charming, articulate, and utterly devoid of empathy. The arrest that should have stopped him. August 16, 1975. Bundy was stopped by a patrol officer in Utah for erratic driving. Inside his Volkswagen Beetle, police found a ski mask, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, and a crowbar. It looked like a burglary kit, or something far worse. He was arrested for possession of burglary tools but soon linked to an attempted kidnapping in Murray, Utah. When investigators realized who they had, Bundy was already facing mounting evidence, hair fibers, eyewitness sketches, and a growing trail of missing women. In 1976, he was convicted of the kidnapping of Carol Duranch, one of the few survivors who had escaped his car alive. But even prison couldn't hold him. The first escape. In 1977, Bundy acted on his obsession with control by outsmarting it. While being held in the Aspen Courthouse Library, he jumped from a second-story window and vanished into the Colorado wilderness. He was recaptured 6 days later. But that taste of freedom only sharpened his hunger. Later that same year, he broke out again, sawing a hole through the ceiling of his cell and slipping through an apartment into the night. This time, he made it out of the state. And when Ted Bundy reappeared, he was in Florida, ready to kill again. The Florida State Murders. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. He moved room to room with brutal precision, bludgeoning, strangling, and assaulting 4 women within minutes. 2 died instantly. 2 others barely survived. When police arrived, they found a bloody trail leading out the back door. Bundy was already gone. 3 weeks later, he struck again, abducting and murdering 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Her body was found in a wooded area near Suwannee River. Bundy was arrested soon after during a routine traffic stop, driving a stolen car, smiling as if nothing had happened. According to Florida court records, he gave the officer a false name, Kenneth Meisner. But fingerprints didn't lie. They belonged to the most wanted men in America. The trial of a lifetime. Bundy's 1979 trial became the first televised murder trial in U.S. history. The courtroom was filled with spectators, some horrified, others fascinated by his charm. Women wrote him letters, attended hearings, and even claimed to be in love with him. He cross-examined witnesses himself, using his legal knowledge to turn the proceedings into a stage performance. But the evidence was overwhelming: bite marks, fibers, eyewitnesses, and his own arrogance. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. He received 2 death sentences. Bundy smiled when the verdict was read. The confessions before death. Over the next decade on Florida's death row, Bundy became both a study subject and a symbol. Psychologists interviewed him for insight into the criminal mind. Reporters visited him in hopes of last-minute confessions. He gave interviews to Dr. James Dobson, admitting to at least 30 murders, though experts believe the real number could be much higher. In those interviews, he tried to shift blame, claiming pornography had fueled his violence. But his calm delivery betrayed no remorse. He spoke about death like a technician, describing each killing in cold, procedural detail. "I didn't feel hate," he said. "I felt nothing." His execution was set for January 24, 1989. The end, and the beginning of a myth. On the morning of his execution, crowds gathered outside Florida State Prison, holding signs that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn." Vendors sold electric chair t-shirts. Inside, Bundy met with a pastor, offered a final statement of repentance, and at 7:16 a.m., he was declared dead by electrocution. The crowd outside erupted in cheers. But for investigators, Bundy's death didn't end the fascination. It began it. The FBI's behavioral science unit used his case to develop new profiling techniques. He became the blueprint for the organized serial killer: methodical, manipulative, intelligent. His interviews are still studied today in criminology programs across the world. Bundy remains a paradox, a man who wore normalcy like a mask, and evil like a second skin. He looked like the boy next door, but his mind was a labyrinth of cruelty. Legacy of deception. Even in death, Bundy's influence lingers. Television series, documentaries, and books dissect his psychology, some painting him as a warning, others as a curiosity. But the true horror of Ted Bundy isn't in what he did. It's in how easy it was for him to hide it. He wasn't the monster in the dark. He was the man holding the flashlight. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. All information is based on verified court filings, FBI records, and documented interviews with investigators and journalists.